I stared at my phone screen showing Jake's name at 2:30 in the morning, his sobbing voice begging me to come home because our parents discovered his gambling debts and were threatening complete disownment. He claimed he desperately needed my help, convincing them to forgive him one final time. But as I listened to his pathetic pleas, memories flooded back of how my brother destroyed my scholarship dreams 3 years ago by stealing my identity to cover his debts, and how our parents blamed me for being irresponsible with personal information instead of holding him accountable for his theft. The phone call transported me back to the nightmare that began when I was 25 years old. Jake hadn't simply stolen my identity once like I'd initially told people to save face. The truth was far more sinister and calculated than anyone knew, including our parents, who lived in willful ignorance about their golden son's criminal behavior. My brother had systematically destroyed every aspect of my financial life with the precision of a professional con artist. He'd used my social security number to open 7 different credit cards, maxing each one out within weeks. He'd taken out a $15,000 student loan in my name money that never saw the inside of any classroom, but instead disappeared into online poker sites and sports betting platforms. The discovery came on what should have been one of the happiest days of my life. David and I had just gotten engaged, and we were applying for a mortgage to buy our first home together. The loan officer's confused expression when she pulled my credit report should have prepared me for what was coming, but nothing could have softened that blow. My credit score sat at 423. 7 maxed-out credit cards, a defaulted student loan, 3 unpaid medical bills for services I'd never received, and 2 collection agencies actively pursuing me for debts I'd never incurred. The loan officer asked if I'd been the victim of identity theft, and I remember laughing bitterly because the thief shared my last name and my childhood bedroom. When I confronted Jake with the evidence, he broke down crying and promised to make everything right. He swore he'd been planning to pay everything back before I ever found out, claiming he just needed a little time to hit it big and cover all the debts. Our parents rallied around him immediately when I demanded they press charges, treating his criminal behavior like an unfortunate mistake rather than a calculated betrayal. Mom sat me down at the kitchen table where she'd helped me with homework for 12 years and explained that families don't destroy each other over money. Dad nodded along, adding that Jake was sick and needed treatment, not prison time. They'd already researched gambling addiction therapy programs and were willing to pay for the best treatment available, but only if I agreed not to involve law enforcement. The ultimatum was clear without being spoken aloud: choose family loyalty or choose justice, but I couldn't have both. If I pressed charges against Jake, I'd be the daughter who sent her brother to prison over financial problems that could be resolved with patience and understanding. They painted my desire for accountability as vindictive and my demand for justice as selfish family destruction. So I agreed to their terms, believing that taking responsibility for Jake's debts was a temporary sacrifice that would lead to his recovery and our family's healing. I spent the next 18 months working 3 jobs to pay off $67,000 in debt I'd never created, watching my savings disappear and my dreams of homeownership crumble while Jake attended twice-weekly therapy sessions that our parents funded completely. David tried to be supportive initially, but the financial strain destroyed our relationship piece by piece. We couldn't afford the wedding we'd planned, couldn't qualify for the house we'd wanted, couldn't even afford to go out for dinner without carefully checking our account balance first. Every conversation became about money we didn't have and sacrifices we were making for my brother's mistakes. The final breaking point came when David found me crying over another collection notice at our kitchen table. He'd reached his limit with the financial chaos and emotional turmoil that Jake's actions had brought into our lives. David gave me back the engagement ring with tears in his eyes, explaining that he couldn't build a future with someone whose family would always put her brother's problems before their shared goals and dreams. I lost my apartment 6 months later when the rent increased, and my damaged credit prevented me from qualifying for anywhere else decent. My car got repossessed when I fell behind on payments while prioritizing Jake's debt obligations. I moved into a studio apartment in a questionable neighborhood, the only place that would accept someone with my credit score, even with a cosigner. Meanwhile, Jake completed his treatment program, and our parents threw him a graduation celebration dinner. They praised his commitment to recovery and his newfound understanding of addiction's impact on family relationships. He thanked everyone for their support and promised that his gambling days were permanently behind him, delivering a heartfelt speech about the importance of family forgiveness and second chances. I sat at that dinner table, financially ruined and emotionally exhausted, watching our parents beam with pride at their reformed son, while completely ignoring the daughter who'd sacrificed everything to clean up his mess. Jake caught my eye during his speech and smiled, but there was something cold behind his expression that made my stomach turn with unease. That was 3 years ago, and I'd spent the time since rebuilding my life from nothing while maintaining minimal contact with my family. I'd worked tirelessly to repair my credit, slowly paying off the remaining debts and establishing new positive payment history. I'd found a decent job, saved enough for a security deposit on a better apartment, and started dating someone who knew nothing about my brother's criminal history or my family's dysfunction. Now Jake was on the phone crying again, begging for my help with another crisis, expecting me to rush home and fix whatever mess he'd created this time. The desperation in his voice sounded exactly like 3 years ago, and I felt that familiar knot of dread forming in my stomach as I realized that Jake's recovery had been nothing more than an elaborate performance for our gullible parents. Against every instinct screaming at me to hang up and block his number, I found myself asking Jake what had happened this time. His response sent ice through my veins and confirmed my worst fears about his so-called recovery and commitment to changing his destructive patterns. Jake confessed through broken sobs that he'd stolen $50,000 from our father's business account money that had been specifically saved for our mother's upcoming cancer treatment. The gravity of his latest theft made his previous crimes against me seem almost insignificant by comparison, though the familiar pattern of targeting family members for easy money remained disturbingly consistent. Our mother had been diagnosed with breast cancer 4 months earlier, and the family had been pooling resources to ensure she could afford the best possible treatment at a specialized cancer center in the city. Dad had been setting aside money from his small construction business for months, working extra hours and taking on additional projects to build up the treatment fund that represented hope for Mom's recovery and survival. Jake's voice cracked as he explained how he'd discovered Dad's business account information while helping with paperwork during Mom's initial diagnosis period. He'd convinced himself that borrowing the money temporarily wouldn't hurt anyone because he'd planned to double the amount through online sports betting before the treatment schedule required payment to the medical center. The $50,000 had vanished in a single weekend of catastrophic losses on basketball playoff games that Jake had researched extensively and felt confident about predicting. He'd been so certain about his betting strategy that he'd placed increasingly larger wagers as his losses mounted, convinced that one big win would recover everything and prove his gambling skills, rather than acknowledging his addiction had never been addressed. Dad had discovered the missing money that evening while reviewing accounts to schedule Mom's surgery payments. The cancer center required a significant upfront deposit before beginning the intensive treatment protocol, and Dad's horrified realization that their carefully saved funds had disappeared sent him into a panic that triggered chest pains severe enough to require emergency medication. Mom's surgery had been postponed indefinitely while they figured out how to replace the stolen treatment money. The cancer center had a waiting list of several months for new patients, meaning that the delay Jake had caused could potentially impact Mom's chances for a successful treatment if her condition worsened while they scrambled to rebuild their savings. The medical consequences of Jake's theft made the situation exponentially more serious than his previous financial crimes against me. He wasn't just stealing money anymore. He was potentially stealing time from our mother's fight against a disease that wouldn't pause its progression while the family dealt with his gambling addiction and its devastating aftermath. Dad was currently at the emergency room getting his heart palpitations checked by a cardiologist, while Mom sat at home crying over the destruction of their treatment plans. Jake had spent the evening lying about the missing money before finally confessing when Dad threatened to involve the police and insurance companies to investigate what appeared to be business account fraud. The desperation in Jake's voice intensified as he begged me to come home and help convince our parents not to press charges or disown him completely. He claimed that losing his family would destroy any chance he had for recovery, and he promised this time was different because he'd finally hit rock bottom and was ready to commit to serious change. But I could hear the familiar manipulation tactics embedded in his pleas, the same emotional blackmail he'd used 3 years earlier when I'd caught him stealing my identity. Jake knew exactly which buttons to push to make me feel guilty for considering his accountability over family harmony, and he was already positioning himself as the victim who needed rescue rather than the criminal who'd potentially endangered our mother's health. His final confession revealed the full scope of the current crisis and confirmed my suspicions about his calculated criminal behavior. Jake admitted that our parents had just discovered not only the missing treatment money, but also irregularities in the business books going back several months, suggesting his theft had been ongoing rather than a desperate one-time mistake triggered by Mom's medical bills. The family business that Dad had built over 20 years was now under scrutiny from both parents, who were beginning to realize that Jake's access to company information had coincided with a pattern of unexplained financial shortfalls they'd previously attributed to economic downturns and increased competition in the construction industry. As Jake continued crying on the phone, I realized that his latest crimes represented an escalation from targeting individual family members to systematically stealing from the business that supported our entire family's financial stability. His gambling addiction had evolved into sophisticated criminal behavior that threatened not just individual victims, but the economic foundation our father had spent decades building for all of us. Despite every rational thought telling me to stay away from this disaster, I found myself driving the 3-hour trip back to my childhood home as dawn broke over the highway. Something about the desperation in Jake's voice and the mention of Mom's cancer treatment had triggered my old protective instincts, even though I knew intellectually that rushing to help him was exactly the wrong response to his criminal behavior. The house looked the same from the outside, but I could feel the tension radiating from within before I even reached the front door. Dad's truck was missing from the driveway, confirming he was still at the hospital, getting his heart checked, while Mom's car sat in its usual spot, looking somehow smaller and more fragile than I remembered from my last visit. Mom opened the door before I could knock her face, showing the strain of dealing with both a cancer diagnosis and her son's latest betrayal simultaneously. She'd lost weight since I'd seen her last, and the stress of the evening had left dark circles under her eyes that made her look older and more vulnerable than her 58 years. Jake sat at the kitchen table where he'd once done homework and eaten countless family dinners, but now he looked like a stranger wearing my brother's face. 3 years of supposed recovery had actually aged him in ways that suggested his problems had worsened rather than improved, despite the optimistic progress reports our parents had been sharing with me during our brief phone conversations. The conversation that followed revealed the depth of my family's dysfunction and their complete inability to hold Jake accountable for his escalating criminal behavior. Mom immediately launched into a tearful plea for me to help Jake through this crisis, framing his theft of her cancer treatment money as a family problem that required family solutions rather than law enforcement intervention. She explained that Jake had promised to enter a more intensive treatment program and had already researched facilities that specialized in gambling addiction recovery. Mom believed that sending him to prison would destroy any chance he had for genuine healing, and she'd rather sacrifice her own medical treatment than see her son's life ruined by criminal charges and incarceration. The twisted logic of prioritizing Jake's comfort over her own cancer treatment revealed how completely our parents had lost perspective about appropriate consequences for serious crimes. Mom genuinely believed that protecting Jake from accountability was more important than securing her own medical care, demonstrating the toxic enabling pattern that had allowed his behavior to escalate unchecked for years. Jake sat silently during Mom's speech, occasionally wiping his eyes and nodding along when she mentioned his promises to change and commitment to recovery, but I caught him checking his phone several times during her emotional appeals, and his body language suggested impatience rather than genuine remorse for the chaos he'd created. When Mom finished her plea, she delivered the bombshell request that revealed the true reason Jake had called me home. She asked me to co-sign a loan using my newly rebuilt credit to cover the $50,000 Jake had stolen, framing this request as my opportunity to save both her medical treatment and our family's unity by providing the financial solution that would resolve everything cleanly. My refusal to immediately agree to their request triggered an explosive response from Dad, who'd apparently returned from the hospital while I was focused on Mom's manipulation attempts. His face was flushed with anger and medication side effects as he shouted that I was being selfish and vindictive by refusing to help my own family during their greatest crisis. Dad's verbal attack revealed that Jake had been lying about my life and financial situation to our parents for months, painting me as wildly successful and wealthy enough to easily afford the loan they were requesting. According to Jake's fabrications, I was making close to 6 figures at my job and had been saving money for years while refusing to help my struggling family with their various financial challenges. The irony of Dad accusing me of selfishness while asking me to take financial responsibility for Jake's crimes was staggering, especially considering I'd spent 18 months cleaning up Jake's previous theft without any acknowledgement of my sacrifice or gratitude for protecting him from criminal prosecution at my own expense. But the most crushing revelation came when Dad explained that they viewed my 2-year period of limited contact as abandonment during their time of need. In their minds, my decision to focus on rebuilding my own life rather than continuing to enable Jake's destructive behavior had transformed me from victim to villain in their family narrative. Jake had apparently been feeding them stories about my selfishness and superiority complex during my absence, convincing them that I looked down on their struggles and felt too good to maintain close family relationships. He'd rewritten history to cast himself as the family member trying to bridge the gap between his judgmental sister and his loving parents, who just wanted their daughter to care about them again. The manipulation was sophisticated and calculated, designed to make me feel guilty for establishing healthy boundaries while positioning Jake as the family member trying to maintain relationships despite my supposed rejection of them. He'd spent 2 years poisoning their perception of my motives while presenting himself as the concerned brother worried about our family's growing distance. As Dad continued his angry lecture about family loyalty and my obligations to help during crises, I realized that Jake had successfully convinced our parents that I owed them this favor, rather than the other way around. In their minds, co-signing for Jake's theft would be me finally contributing to the family after years of selfish abandonment, rather than me once again sacrificing my financial stability to enable my brother's criminal behavior. The complete reversal of reality was breathtaking in its audacity and effectiveness. Jake had managed to transform himself from criminal to victim, while casting me as the successful but selfish daughter whose refusal to help represented a moral failing rather than a reasonable boundary with someone who'd already stolen from me once before. When our parents left the room to discuss what they called my disappointing response to their reasonable request for help, Jake finally dropped the tearful victim act he'd been performing for their benefit. The transformation was instantaneous and chilling, like watching someone remove a carefully crafted mask to reveal their true face underneath. Jake leaned back in his chair with a cold smile that made my skin crawl, his puffy eyes from fake crying suddenly sharp and calculating as he studied my reaction to his personality shift. The broken, remorseful brother who'd been sobbing about rock bottom and recovery disappeared, completely replaced by someone who looked at me like I was a chess piece he was planning to manipulate across the board. His voice dropped to a quiet, confident tone as he told me he'd known I would come home and help him because I was too soft and had always been the family pushover who couldn't stand seeing other people in pain. Jake's psychological assessment of my character was disturbingly accurate and revealed how carefully he'd been studying my responses to manipulation over the years. The conversation that followed exposed the true scope of Jake's deception and his sophisticated understanding of family dynamics that he'd been exploiting for his own benefit. He casually admitted to lying extensively about my life to our parents, creating a fictional version of my success that would make his financial requests seem reasonable rather than outrageous. According to the stories Jake had been telling, I was making $90,000 per year at my job and had been secretly saving money while refusing to help with family expenses out of spite and superiority. He'd invented details about expensive vacations I'd never taken and luxury purchases I'd never made, building a narrative of my wealth and selfishness that justified their expectation of financial assistance. Jake had also fabricated property ownership claims, telling our parents I'd bought a condo and was building significant equity while my family struggled with medical bills and business challenges. The fictional real estate holdings were designed to make the loan request seem like a small favor from someone with substantial assets, rather than a massive financial burden on someone still recovering from his previous theft. But the most disturbing revelation was Jake's admission that he'd been monitoring my financial recovery for months, somehow tracking my credit score improvement and savings account growth with information he shouldn't have had access to. His detailed knowledge of my banking activity suggested he'd either maintained access to my personal information or had found new ways to spy on my financial progress. Jake's confidence about my eventual cooperation stemmed from his belief that I was psychologically incapable of letting our family suffer when I had the power to help them. He'd been observing my responses to guilt and manipulation for years, and he was convinced that my empathy and sense of responsibility would override my logical understanding of his criminal behavior patterns. When I threatened to expose his lies and manipulation to our parents, Jake's laughter was genuinely amused rather than nervous or defensive. He explained that our parents would never believe my accusations over his word, because he'd spent 2 years carefully building credibility while portraying me as bitter and resentful about imaginary family slights and grievances. The psychological warfare Jake had been waging was more sophisticated than I'd realized, involving not just lies about current situations, but a complete reframing of our family history that cast my reasonable responses to his theft as overreactions and vindictiveness. He'd convinced our parents that I was the problem family member whose judgment couldn't be trusted when it came to family matters. Jake's final threat revealed the true depth of his sociopathic thinking and his willingness to destroy anyone who interfered with his plans. He calmly explained that if I refused to help him this time, he would make sure I lost contact with our parents permanently by convincing them that I was actively trying to destroy their family for revenge against childhood grievances they didn't even remember. The methodical way Jake described his plans to isolate me from my family was terrifying in its calculated cruelty and demonstrated that his supposed gambling addiction was just one symptom of a much more serious personality disorder that our family had never recognized or addressed properly. As I sat there listening to my brother outline his strategies for psychological manipulation and family destruction, I realized that the tearful, desperate young man who'd called me in the middle of the night was just another performance in a long series of deceptions designed to exploit my love and concern for my family's well-being. Jake had been playing a complex, long-term game that involved not just stealing money, but systematically destroying family relationships to maintain his position as the favored child, whose problems required everyone else's sacrifices and support. His gambling addiction was real, but it was just one tool in a broader pattern of exploitation that targeted anyone with emotional connections to him. The brother I'd grown up with and loved had either never really existed or had been replaced by someone capable of weaponizing family bonds for personal gain, without any genuine remorse or concern for the collateral damage his actions caused to people who cared about him. Excusing myself to use the bathroom, I needed a moment away from Jake's chilling confession and the suffocating atmosphere of manipulation that filled our childhood home. But what I discovered in that small bathroom would change everything I thought I knew about my brother's criminal activities and the true scope of danger our family was facing. Behind the toilet tank, wedged between the porcelain and the wall in a space barely visible unless someone was looking for it, I found Jake's laptop wrapped in a waterproof bag. The hiding spot was so carefully chosen and concealed that it was clear Jake had been using our parents' house as a storage location for sensitive materials he couldn't risk keeping at his own apartment. The laptop wasn't password protected, suggesting Jake's arrogance about his ability to manipulate our family had made him careless about operational security. What I found on that computer revealed criminal activities far beyond gambling addiction and family theft, exposing a sophisticated operation that had put multiple innocent people in serious danger. Jake's email account contained hundreds of messages between him and various loan sharks, revealing debts totaling over $200,000 to dangerous people whose patience was rapidly running out. The communications showed escalating threats of violence that had progressed from vague intimidation to specific plans for collecting debts through attacks on family members if Jake couldn't produce payment within days. But the loan shark correspondence was just the beginning of what I discovered on that laptop. Jake had been running a systematic identity theft operation targeting elderly people from his gambling addiction support groups, using the trust and vulnerability of people seeking recovery to gain access to their personal information and financial accounts. The computer contained detailed files on at least 15 different elderly victims, including our own grandfather Paul, with photographs of their homes, copies of their identification documents, and records of credit accounts Jake had opened using their information. The sophistication of his operation was staggering, involving forged signatures, fake identification documents, and a network of the accomplices who helped him cash fraudulent checks and make large withdrawals from compromised accounts. Jake had been photographing documents during visits to elderly support group members under the guise of helping them organize their paperwork for recovery-related financial planning. He'd convinced vulnerable people that he was helping them protect their assets from gambling-related financial mistakes while actually cataloging their personal information for future theft and fraud. The email records showed Jake had been selling batches of stolen personal information to organized crime groups who used the data for large-scale financial fraud operations across multiple states. His gambling addiction had evolved into a cover story for much more serious criminal activities that generated steady income far beyond anything he could win through sports betting or casino games. Most disturbing were the files related to our grandfather Paul, showing that Jake had been systematically stealing from him for over 6 months, while maintaining the pretense of being a caring grandson who visited regularly to check on his well-being. Jake had forged Grandpa's signature on multiple loan documents, using his excellent credit and paid-off house as collateral for borrowing that Grandpa had no knowledge of. The laptop contained photographs of forged documents that made Grandpa responsible for debts exceeding $100,000 money that Jake had borrowed against our grandfather's house and retirement savings without his knowledge or consent. The loan paperwork was sophisticated enough to fool financial institutions, suggesting Jake was working with professional document forgers who specialized in elder fraud. Email communications revealed that some of these loans were coming due within weeks, and the lenders were already making inquiries about collecting payments from our grandfather, who had no idea he was legally responsible for debts he'd never incurred. Jake's theft of Grandpa's identity wasn't just stealing money, it was setting up an elderly man for financial ruin and potential homelessness if the forged loans were enforced. The computer also contained Jake's communications with accomplices who helped him execute various fraud schemes, including people who provided fake identification documents, others who helped him open bank accounts under stolen identities, and contacts within financial institutions who facilitated large withdrawals and transfers without proper verification procedures. Jake's criminal network was extensive and professional, involving dozens of people across multiple states who specialize in different aspects of identity theft and financial fraud. His gambling addiction support group had become a hunting ground for vulnerable victims, and his family relationships provided both emotional cover for his activities and additional targets for theft when other sources of money weren't sufficient. The evidence on that laptop proved that Jake's theft of Mom's cancer treatment money wasn't a desperate mistake triggered by addiction, but rather a calculated crime committed by someone running a sophisticated criminal enterprise that required steady cash flow to maintain operations and pay criminal associates. As I photographed the evidence with my phone, I realized that our family's problems went far beyond dealing with a gambling addict who'd stolen from relatives. Jake was a career criminal whose activities had put multiple innocent people in danger, including elderly victims who trusted him and family members who had no idea they were connected to serious, organized crime activities. The laptop contained enough evidence to send Jake to federal prison for decades, but it also revealed that our family was now in immediate physical danger from loan sharks and criminal associates who expected payment for debts that Jake had no intention or ability to pay from legitimate sources. Hiding the laptop back in its original location, I returned to the kitchen, knowing that the tearful family confrontation happening in our living room was just a small part of a much larger criminal operation that threatened not just our family's financial stability, but potentially our physical safety as well. Jake looked up when I returned, and for a moment I thought I saw suspicion in his eyes, as if he sensed that something had changed during my absence. But then he resumed his manipulation performance, apparently confident that his psychological control over our family dynamics would overcome any evidence or logical arguments I might present to challenge his victim narrative. My hands shook as I dialed Grandpa Paul's number from my car in the driveway, praying he would answer despite the late hour. At 80 years old, he kept early bedtime schedules, but the urgency of what I discovered on Jake's laptop made waiting until morning impossible. Grandpa's voice sounded tired but alert when he picked up after several rings, and his immediate question about whether everything was all right revealed an underlying anxiety that hadn't been present during our previous conversations. When I asked if he was okay and whether anything unusual had been happening lately, the long pause before his response told me everything I needed to know. The story that emerged during our hushed conversation painted a picture of an elderly man living in fear while trying to protect his family from problems he didn't fully understand. Grandpa had been receiving threatening phone calls for months with strange voices demanding payments for loans he couldn't remember taking and threatening consequences if money wasn't delivered according to schedules he'd never agreed to. The callers had detailed personal information about Grandpa's daily routine, including his weekly grocery shopping trips, his Tuesday morning coffee meetings with friends at the local diner, and even his medical appointments with his cardiologist. They demonstrated knowledge of his house layout, his car's license plate number, and the names of his neighbors in ways that made him feel constantly watched and vulnerable. Strange men had been visiting his neighborhood, parking across from his house for hours at a time and taking photographs of his property. Grandpa had noticed the same unfamiliar vehicles appearing repeatedly near his home, and neighbors had mentioned seeing people asking questions about his living situation and daily schedule. The most terrifying incidents involved direct approaches when Grandpa was away from his house. Men had approached him at the grocery store and the bank, making casual conversation that included specific details about his finances and family relationships that strangers shouldn't have known. They'd asked about his grandson Jake in ways that seemed friendly but felt threatening to Grandpa's instincts. Grandpa confessed he'd been too scared to leave his house for several weeks, except when absolutely necessary, and he'd started keeping his curtains closed during the day because he felt like people were watching his windows. The psychological impact of months of intimidation had transformed his comfortable retirement home into a prison where he felt trapped and constantly anxious about his safety. When I asked about the insurance papers Jake had convinced him to sign, Grandpa's voice became even smaller and more frightened. He explained that Jake had visited several months earlier with official-looking documents that supposedly protected Grandpa's assets in case Jake's gambling problems created legal issues that might affect family members financially. Jake had presented the paperwork as a precautionary measure recommended by his addiction counselors, explaining that recovering gambling addicts often needed to ensure their family members' assets were legally protected from potential creditor claims or legal complications related to past gambling debts. The documents had been complex and filled with legal terminology that Grandpa didn't fully understand, but Jake had assured him they were standard protective measures that wouldn't affect Grandpa's ownership of his house or access to his retirement accounts. Jake had even brought someone he introduced as a notary public to witness Grandpa's signature and make the documents legally valid. Grandpa now realized that the supposed insurance papers were actually loan documents that made him responsible for substantial debts he'd never intended to incur. The threatening phone calls had started shortly after he'd signed Jake's paperwork, and the amounts being demanded matched the figures Jake had mentioned when explaining how much protection Grandpa's assets needed from potential creditor claims. The sophistication of Jake's deception had convinced an intelligent man to sign away his financial security while believing he was protecting it. Grandpa had trusted his grandson completely and had never suspected that the legal paperwork was anything other than what Jake claimed it to be, especially when Jake brought an official notary to witness the signatures. But Grandpa's most devastating revelation concerned the impact Jake's crimes were having on his physical and mental health. The constant stress of threatening phone calls and surveillance had triggered anxiety attacks that required emergency room visits, and his blood pressure medication had been increased twice to address stress-related hypertension. Grandpa had been living in isolation for months, too frightened to tell family members about the threats, because the callers had specifically warned him that involving police or family would result in immediate violence against people he cared about. He'd been suffering alone while Jake continued visiting him regularly, maintaining the pretense of being a caring grandson while actually monitoring the success of his criminal operation. The elderly man who'd helped raise me and taught me to fish on summer weekends was now trapped in his own home because his trusted grandson had sold his identity to dangerous criminals who viewed him as collateral for debts he'd never agreed to pay. Jake's betrayal of our grandfather represented a level of cruelty that went beyond simple theft into psychological torture of someone who'd shown him nothing but love and support. As Grandpa's voice broke while describing his fear and isolation, I realized that Jake's criminal activities weren't just hurting strangers or even immediate family members. He was systematically destroying the people who loved him most, using their trust and affection as weapons against them while maintaining the facade of being a troubled young man who needed their support and understanding. The conversation ended with Grandpa begging me not to tell anyone about our discussion because he was terrified that the men threatening him would hurt our family if they discovered he'd talked about the situation. His fear was so genuine and overwhelming that I promised to keep his secret while privately vowing to find a way to protect him from the consequences of Jake's criminal enterprises. Sitting in my car outside our family home, I understood that the crisis Jake had created went far beyond stealing Mom's cancer treatment money or manipulating our parents into enabling his behavior. He'd put our grandfather's life in danger and had been systematically terrorizing an elderly man while pretending to be concerned about family relationships and recovery from addiction. Leaving Grandpa's house after our devastating phone conversation, I felt the weight of knowing how extensive Jake's criminal activities had become and how many innocent people were suffering because of his sophisticated fraud operations. But I was completely unprepared for the direct confrontation that awaited me in Grandpa's driveway. Two men approached my car before I could start the engine, their casual stride and confident demeanor immediately setting off alarm bells in my mind. They looked like they belonged in the neighborhood dressed in ordinary clothes that wouldn't attract attention, but something about their purposeful movement toward my vehicle made my heart rate spike with instinctive fear. The older man tapped on my window with a heavy ring that made a sharp sound against the glass, his smile friendly enough, but his eyes cold and calculating in ways that made my skin crawl. When I reluctantly rolled down the window a few inches, he leaned closer and asked if I was Jake's girlfriend, his tone conversational, but with an underlying edge that suggested this wasn't a casual inquiry. My denial that I was romantically involved with Jake seemed to confuse them momentarily, but then the younger man pulled out his phone and showed me a photograph of Jake and me together at our cousin's wedding 2 years earlier. The fact that they had surveillance photos of family events revealed the depth of their investigation into Jake's personal relationships and their systematic approach to identifying people who might have financial or emotional connections to him. When I explained that Jake was my brother, their demeanor shifted slightly, becoming more businesslike, but also more threatening as they realized they'd found a family member who might have influence over Jake's behavior or access to resources that could resolve his debt obligations to their organization. The message they delivered was simple and terrifying in its specificity. Jake had exactly 72 hours to produce $50,000 in cash, or their organization would begin collecting payment through alternative methods that involved targeting family members, beginning with the elderly man whose house we were currently parked in front of. They showed me additional photographs on their phones that documented their extensive surveillance of our family's daily routines and living situations. Pictures of Grandpa's house from multiple angles, including shots of him leaving for his weekly grocery trips and returning home with his purchases. Images of our parents' house and business location, with timestamps showing they'd been watching these locations for weeks. Most chilling were the photographs of my own apartment building and workplace, proving that Jake's criminal associations had identified and investigated every family member who might potentially be used as leverage to ensure his debt payments. They knew where I lived, where I worked, what kind of car I drove, and when I typically left for work each morning. The younger man explained their collection process with casual efficiency, describing how they would start with property damage and escalate through personal injury until someone in Jake's family produced the money he owed or convinced him to surrender himself for more permanent debt resolution methods. Grandpa's house would be their first target because elderly people were easier to intimidate and less likely to involve law enforcement when threatened. They'd already done extensive research on his daily schedule, his neighbors' routines, and the response times for police calls to his area of town. The photographs they showed me included detailed shots of Grandpa's daily activities, taken with telephoto lenses from distant positions, proving they'd been conducting professional surveillance operations that documented his vulnerability and isolation. They knew he lived alone, had limited physical mobility, and maintained predictable routines that would make him easy to find and corner when they decided to escalate their collection efforts. But their surveillance hadn't been limited to gathering information for future threats. They casually mentioned that they'd already made contact with Grandpa through phone calls and brief encounters at public places, testing his awareness of the situation and his emotional responses to different types of pressure and intimidation. The fact that they'd been systematically terrorizing my grandfather while Jake continued his family manipulation performance made my blood boil with rage at my brother's callousness and complete disregard for the consequences his crimes were having on innocent people who loved and trusted him. When I demanded to know why they were targeting family members instead of Jake himself, the older man laughed and explained that Jake had become expert at avoiding direct contact with creditors by changing addresses frequently and using false names for most of his daily activities. His family members were static targets with established routines and emotional connections that made them much more effective leverage for debt collection purposes. Their organization had learned that gambling addicts typically responded better to threats against family members than threats against themselves, especially when the family members were elderly or vulnerable in ways that made them easy targets for escalating violence if payment schedules weren't maintained according to agreed-upon terms. The casual way they discussed plans for terrorizing elderly people and innocent family members revealed that this wasn't their first experience collecting gambling debts through intimidation and violence. They had systematic approaches for identifying vulnerable family members and escalating pressure until someone produced payment or the debtor surrendered himself for final resolution. As they prepared to leave, the older man handed me a business card with only a phone number printed on it, explaining that I had until Thursday evening to either produce Jake's $50,000 payment or convince him to contact them directly to discuss alternative arrangements for resolving his debt obligations. Their final warning was that involving law enforcement would immediately trigger the violent collection process they'd been postponing while giving Jake opportunities to resolve his debts through family assistance. Police involvement would be interpreted as Jake's decision to prioritize his own safety over his family's well-being, and their response would be swift and permanent. Driving away from Grandpa's neighborhood, I realized that Jake's gambling addiction had evolved into something far more dangerous than family theft or even identity fraud. He'd become involved with serious criminal organizations that used violence and terrorism to collect debts, and his financial obligations to these people had put our entire family in immediate physical danger. The 72-hour deadline meant that my family's safety now depended on either producing a massive amount of money or finding a way to neutralize the threat these people represented to innocent family members who had no involvement in Jake's criminal activities but were being targeted because of their emotional connections to him. The threatening encounter with Jake's creditors convinced me that our family situation had escalated far beyond anything we could handle privately. Despite the loan shark's warnings about law enforcement involvement, I knew that protecting my grandfather and parents required professional intervention from people trained to deal with organized crime and violent debt collection. At the local police station, I explained the situation to a detective who specialized in financial crimes, providing copies of the photographs I had taken from Jake's laptop, along with detailed information about the threats our family had received from his criminal associates. The detective's expression grew increasingly serious as she reviewed the evidence and realized the scope of criminal activity we were dealing with. Detective Sarah Martinez explained that cases involving identity theft combined with loan shark intimidation typically indicated connections to larger organized crime operations that required federal investigation. rather than local law enforcement response. She immediately contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit to report what appeared to be a multi-state identity theft ring with connections to violent criminal organizations. The response was faster than I'd expected, with FBI agent Robert Chen arriving at the police station within 2 hours to interview me about Jake's criminal activities and the evidence I discovered on his laptop. Agent Chen's questions revealed that Jake was already under federal investigation as part of a broader probe into identity theft operations targeting elderly victims across multiple states. The FBI had been tracking a network of criminals who specialized in elder fraud, using nursing homes, addiction support groups, and community organizations to identify vulnerable elderly people whose personal information could be stolen and used for large-scale financial fraud operations. Jake's name had appeared in their investigation several months earlier when multiple elderly victims reported similar fraud patterns involving forged loan documents and intimidation tactics. Agent Chen explained that Jake's gambling addiction support group had been infiltrated by federal agents after several elderly members reported identical fraud experiences involving a young man who'd helped them organize their financial paperwork before their identities were stolen and used for unauthorized borrowing against their property and retirement accounts. The sophisticated nature of the fraud operation suggested professional criminal organization, rather than individual gambling addicts acting independently. The forged documents, fake notary services, and coordinated intimidation campaigns required resources and expertise that pointed to established crime networks with specialized roles for different participants in the fraud schemes. But Agent Chen's most shocking revelation was that Jake wasn't just a participant in this criminal network. He was one of its primary organizers and had been recruiting other gambling addicts to help identify and target elderly victims through various support groups and community organizations across multiple states. The FBI had evidence that Jake had been running recruitment meetings where he taught other gambling addicts how to gain elderly people's trust and access their personal information for identity theft purposes. He developed training materials that explained how to forge documents, create fake identification, and coordinate with criminal associates who specialized in different aspects of the fraud operations. Jake's criminal enterprise had generated hundreds of thousands of dollars over the past 18 months, with dozens of elderly victims losing their homes' retirement savings and financial security to his sophisticated fraud schemes. The investigation had identified victims in 6 different states, all following the same pattern of trusted relationships that were exploited for systematic identity theft and financial fraud. The federal investigation had been building cases against Jake and his criminal associates for months, but they'd been waiting to arrest him until they could identify and protect all the elderly victims whose personal information had been compromised by his operations. The timing of my report meant that the FBI could now move forward with arrests while ensuring our family's safety from the violent criminal organizations Jake owed money to. Agent Chen confirmed that the loan sharks threatening our family were indeed connected to organized crime groups that the FBI had been investigating for years in connection with illegal gambling operations and violent debt collection practices. Jake's debts to these organizations weren't just personal gambling losses. They were business obligations related to his role in criminal enterprises that required him to share profits from identity theft operations with his criminal partners. The $50,000 Jake owed wasn't just gambling debt. It was his share of profits from identity theft operations that he'd spent, instead of paying to his criminal associates according to their agreed-upon business arrangements. His theft of Mom's cancer treatment money had been an attempt to pay criminal partners who were threatening violence over his failure to share profits from elderly victims' stolen identities. But the most devastating revelation was that Jake's criminal activities had been ongoing for over a year, while our family believed he was in recovery from gambling addiction. His participation in treatment programs had been a cover story that allowed him to maintain family relationships while actually expanding his criminal operations and recruiting new victims through addiction support networks. The federal charges Jake was facing included identity theft, elder fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy charges that could result in 20 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. The evidence the FBI had collected proved systematic criminal enterprise rather than individual crimes, driven by addiction, making him eligible for enhanced sentences under organized crime statutes. Agent Chen assured me that the FBI would coordinate Jake's arrest with protective measures for our family members, including relocation assistance for Grandpa and surveillance protection for our parents, until the violent criminal organizations threatening our family could be neutralized through their own arrests and prosecutions. The investigation had identified multiple criminal organizations that Jake had been working with, and his arrest would trigger coordinated raids across several states, targeting the entire network of people involved in elder fraud and violent debt collection operations that had been terrorizing innocent families like ours for years. As I signed formal statements and provided detailed testimony about Jake's crimes and threats against our family, I realized that my brother's gambling addiction had been just the surface of much more serious criminal activities that had put dozens of innocent people in danger, while our family struggled to understand and address what we thought was simply an addiction problem requiring support and treatment. The next morning brought federal agents to our family home with search warrants and arrest warrants that would finally expose the true scope of Jake's criminal activities to our parents, who had spent years enabling his behavior through misguided love and complete denial about the seriousness of his crimes against innocent people. Agent Chen arrived with a full investigative team that included forensic accountants, computer specialists, and victim services coordinators who would help our family understand the extent of damage Jake had caused and begin the process of addressing his criminal activities through proper legal channels rather than continued family enabling. Mom answered the door in her bathrobe, clearly expecting another family crisis discussion, rather than federal law enforcement officers with legal documents authorizing them to search the house and arrest her son for serious federal crimes. Her confusion quickly turned to panic as Agent Chen explained that Jake was under federal investigation for identity theft, elder fraud, and conspiracy charges related to organized criminal enterprises. Dad emerged from the kitchen, demanding to know what was happening, his face flushed with anger at what he assumed was government overreach, targeting his son for gambling problems that should be handled through treatment programs rather than criminal prosecution. His protective instincts kicked in immediately, and he began demanding to see warrants and threatening to call lawyers to stop what he characterized as harassment of someone suffering from addiction. But Agent Chen's patient explanation of the charges and evidence against Jake began to crack their denial, as the scope of his criminal activities became impossible to dismiss as simple gambling addiction or family financial problems. The federal investigation had documented systematic crimes against dozens of elderly victims across multiple states, proving criminal enterprise rather than individual mistakes driven by addiction. The search of the house revealed evidence that our parents had been completely unaware of, including forged documents, stolen personal information belonging to elderly victims, and communications with criminal associates involved in various fraud schemes. Jake had been using our childhood home as a storage location for criminal materials while maintaining the facade of being a recovering gambling addict who needed family support and understanding. Mom collapsed in the living room when agents showed her copies of forged loan documents bearing our grandfather's signature, realizing that Jake had been systematically stealing from his own elderly grandfather while visiting him regularly and pretending to be concerned about his well-being and financial security during his retirement years. The evidence that Jake had terrorized Grandpa Paul for months while continuing to visit him as a caring grandson was particularly devastating to Mom, who prided herself on family closeness and had viewed Jake's regular visits to Grandpa as proof of his commitment to family values and personal growth during his recovery process. Dad's anger shifted from protective outrage to horrified realization as forensic accountants explained that Jake had been stealing from the family business for over 2 years, not just the recent $50,000 they discovered the previous evening. The systematic theft had totaled nearly $300,000 over time, explaining the financial struggles their business had experienced that they'd attributed to economic downturns and increased competition. The revelation that Jake had been causing their financial problems while positioning himself as a family member trying to help them through difficult economic times was a betrayal that went beyond simple theft into psychological manipulation designed to make them dependent on his supposed assistance while he was actually destroying their business from within. Agent Chen explained that Jake's theft of Mom's cancer treatment money wasn't a desperate mistake triggered by gambling addiction, but rather a calculated crime committed by someone running a sophisticated criminal enterprise that required steady cash flow to maintain operations and pay criminal associates who specialized in identity theft and elder fraud. The federal investigation had identified Jake as one of the primary organizers of criminal networks that had stolen millions of dollars from elderly victims across 6 states, using nursing homes, addiction support groups, and community organizations to identify vulnerable people whose trust could be exploited for systematic financial fraud. Mom's breakdown became complete when victim services coordinators explained that some of Jake's elderly victims had lost their homes and life savings to his fraud schemes, with several requiring emergency assistance from family members or social services to avoid homelessness and poverty during their final years of life. The human cost of Jake's crimes went far beyond family financial problems into systematic destruction of innocent people's security and dignity during the most vulnerable period of their lives. His exploitation of elderly trust and compassion represented a level of cruelty that our parents had never imagined their son was capable of inflicting on strangers or family members. Dad suffered what appeared to be a minor heart attack when agents explained that the violent threats against our family were related to Jake's failure to share profits from criminal enterprises with his organized crime partners, rather than simple gambling debts to legitimate casinos or sports betting operations. The ambulance that took Dad to the hospital marked the complete collapse of our family's denial about Jake's criminal activities and the beginning of our confrontation with the reality that someone we loved had been systematically destroying innocent people's lives while manipulating our emotions to avoid accountability for increasingly serious crimes. As Jake was arrested and led away in handcuffs, he looked directly at me with an expression of pure hatred that confirmed my suspicions about his sociopathic personality and complete lack of genuine remorse for the pain he'd caused to people who loved and trusted him throughout his life. The federal charges against Jake included 23 counts of identity theft, elder fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy related to organized criminal enterprises that could result in decades in federal prison without possibility of parole if he was convicted of even a fraction of the crimes the FBI had documented during their extensive investigation. 3 days after his arrest, Jake made bail using money from hidden offshore accounts that the FBI hadn't yet located, demonstrating that his criminal operations were even more sophisticated and well-funded than federal investigators had initially realized. His release pending trial gave him the opportunity to launch one final desperate attack against anyone who had cooperated with law enforcement in exposing his crimes. Within hours of posting bail, Jake began executing a revenge plan he'd apparently been preparing for months. as insurance against family members who might eventually threaten his criminal operations. His first target was me, the family member who had discovered evidence of his crimes and cooperated with federal investigators to protect innocent victims and our terrorized grandfather. Jake's counterattack began with a series of phone calls to FBI agent Chen claiming that I had been his partner in the identity theft operations and that all the evidence found in our parents' house had actually been planted there by me to frame him for crimes we'd committed together over the past 2 years. The accusations were sophisticated and detailed, suggesting Jake had been planning this betrayal for a long time and had carefully prepared false evidence that might appear credible to investigators who didn't know our family's complete history. He provided agents with fabricated financial records that appeared to show suspicious deposits in my bank accounts that corresponded with dates when elderly victims had been defrauded by his criminal operations. Jake's most damaging claim was that I had been the mastermind behind the entire elder fraud scheme, and that he had only participated under duress after I threatened to expose his gambling addiction to our parents and destroy his relationships with family members who were supporting his recovery efforts. The false narrative Jake constructed portrayed him as a vulnerable gambling addict who had been exploited and manipulated by his more intelligent and criminally sophisticated sister, who used his addiction and family problems as leverage to force his participation in crimes he was morally opposed to committing against innocent elderly people. His story included fabricated details about how I had supposedly recruited him into criminal activities by offering to help pay his gambling debts in exchange for his assistance with identity theft operations that I was already running through contacts I'd made during my own financial difficulties following his previous theft of my identity and credit. Jake claimed that the evidence found on his laptop had actually been planted there by me during my visit to our parents' house, and that his hiding spot behind the toilet tank was a location I had suggested to him for storing materials that I wanted to keep away from my own apartment, where they might be discovered during any investigation. The counterattack included forged documents that appeared to support Jake's claims about my involvement in criminal activities, including fake email communications between us discussing fraud operations and profit-sharing arrangements that Jake claimed proved our criminal partnership over the past 18 months. Most disturbing was Jake's claim that my cooperation with federal investigators was actually an attempt to eliminate him as a witness who could expose my leadership role in the criminal operations that had defrauded dozens of elderly victims across multiple states. He portrayed my contact with law enforcement as a calculated move to frame him for crimes I had committed while positioning myself as an innocent family member trying to protect other victims. The fabricated evidence Jake presented included fake bank records showing deposits in my accounts that allegedly represented my share of profits from identity theft operations, though the dates and amounts had been carefully chosen to correspond with legitimate deposits from my actual employment and personal savings that could be misinterpreted as suspicious without proper context. Jake's accusations triggered a secondary FBI investigation into my potential involvement in his criminal activities, requiring me to provide detailed financial records, employment verification, and testimony about my knowledge of his crimes and my motivations for cooperating with law enforcement agencies investigating his fraud operations. The stress of being investigated as a potential criminal co-conspirator while dealing with Dad's hospitalization and Mom's cancer treatment created additional pressure on our already devastated family, exactly as Jake had intended when he designed his revenge strategy to maximize psychological damage to people who had dared to hold him accountable. But Jake's most vicious attack was his manipulation of our parents' emotions during their most vulnerable period, convincing them that I was the real criminal who had been using Jake's addiction and their medical problems as cover for my own criminal activities against innocent elderly people. From jail, Jake called our hospitalized father and tearfully confessed that he had been trying to protect the family from my criminal activities for months, but had finally been forced to participate in my fraud schemes when I threatened to destroy his recovery and turn our parents against him during Mom's cancer treatment. The psychological manipulation was sophisticated and cruel, designed to exploit our parents' existing guilt about their enabling behavior by offering them an alternative explanation that made them victims of my deception rather than enablers of Jake's criminal activities. Jake's final element in his counterattack was a series of threatening text messages sent to me from untraceable phone numbers, promising that his criminal associates would target me personally for cooperating with law enforcement, and that my betrayal of their organization would result in permanent consequences that no police protection could prevent. The threats confirmed that Jake's criminal network remained active despite his arrest, and that his cooperation with organized crime groups had created ongoing dangers for family members who had dared to expose his activities to federal investigators seeking to protect innocent victims and prosecute criminal enterprises. In the midst of Jake's vicious counterattack and the FBI's secondary investigation into his false accusations against me, I received an unexpected phone call that would reveal another layer of my brother's calculated destruction of my personal relationships and his systematic sabotage of my happiness over the years. David, my ex-fiancé, whom I hadn't spoken to in almost 3 years, contacted me after seeing news reports about Jake's arrest for federal crimes involving elder fraud and identity theft. His voice was filled with regret and urgency as he explained that he needed to tell me something important about why our relationship had really ended and the role Jake had played in destroying our engagement. The conversation that followed revealed that David had never left me because of the financial problems created by Jake's identity theft and the burden of paying for his criminal debts. Everything I had believed about our breakup and David's reasons for ending our engagement had been based on lies that Jake had carefully constructed to isolate me from supportive relationships during my most vulnerable period. David explained that 3 years earlier, just as we were working through the challenges of my financial situation and making plans to rebuild our future together, despite Jake's theft, he had received a series of anonymous messages containing what appeared to be evidence that I was having an affair with someone from my workplace. The fabricated evidence Jake had sent to David included doctored photographs that appeared to show me in romantic situations with a male coworker, along with fake text message conversations that suggested I was lying to David about working late while actually spending time with another man who was helping me through my emotional struggles. Jake had somehow gained access to my phone and computer during family visits, using that access to create fake communication records that appeared to prove I was cheating on David while accepting his support through the financial crisis Jake himself had created through his identity theft crimes. The psychological sophistication of Jake's manipulation was staggering, as he had used David's own insecurities about our relationship during a stressful period to make the false evidence seem credible and emotionally devastating. David had been struggling with feelings of inadequacy about his ability to help me through my financial problems, making him particularly vulnerable to suggestions that I was seeking emotional support from someone else. David showed me copies of the fabricated evidence that Jake had sent him, including manipulated photographs that had been expertly altered to place me in compromising situations that had never occurred. The fake text message conversations included intimate details about my personality and habits that only someone close to me could have known, making them convincing enough to destroy David's trust in our relationship. The timing of Jake's sabotage had been calculated to maximize its destructive impact, arriving just as David and I were beginning to recover from the stress of dealing with my financial problems, and were making concrete plans for our wedding and future together, despite the challenges we had faced. Jake's destruction of my engagement hadn't been a side effect of his criminal behavior, but rather a deliberate attack on my personal happiness designed to ensure I remained isolated and emotionally vulnerable during the period when I was paying for his debts and enabling his continued criminal activities through my silence about his theft. David's revelation explained why our breakup had seemed so sudden and final, despite the strength of our relationship and our shared commitment to working through the financial difficulties together. He had been heartbroken about what he believed was my betrayal and had ended our engagement to protect himself from further emotional damage rather than confronting me about evidence he thought proved my infidelity. The 3 years David and I had spent apart believing our relationship had been destroyed by financial stress and incompatible goals had actually been the result of Jake's calculated sabotage designed to prevent me from having emotional support that might encourage me to hold him accountable for his criminal behavior against me and other family members. David's decision to contact me after Jake's arrest was motivated by his realization that someone capable of systematic elder fraud and identity theft was also capable of fabricating evidence to destroy personal relationships for strategic purposes. The news reports about Jake's sophisticated criminal operations had made David reconsider the evidence that had convinced him of my infidelity years earlier. But David's most devastating revelation was that Jake had contacted him multiple times over the years to reinforce his belief in my supposed betrayal and to discourage him from attempting to reconcile with me despite his continued feelings for our relationship and his regret about how our engagement had ended. Jake had presented himself as a concerned brother who was worried about David's emotional well-being and wanted to protect him from further hurt by ensuring he understood that I hadn't changed my behavior patterns and was continuing to deceive people who cared about me in various personal and professional relationships. The systematic nature of Jake's interference in my personal relationships revealed that his destruction of my engagement had been part of a broader strategy to isolate me from supportive relationships that might encourage me to seek justice for his crimes or resist his continued exploitation of my family loyalty and guilt. As David and I talked through the years of misunderstanding and manipulation that had kept us apart, I realized that Jake's criminal activities had extended far beyond financial fraud into systematic psychological warfare designed to control and destroy anyone who might threaten his ability to continue his criminal enterprises without accountability or consequences. Jake hadn't just stolen my money and destroyed my credit. He had strategically sabotaged my most important personal relationship to ensure I would remain emotionally isolated and financially vulnerable during the period when he was expanding his criminal operations and needed family members who were too broken and dependent to resist his continued exploitation and manipulation. While Dad recovered in the hospital from his stress-induced heart episode, Mom asked me to help her review the family business financial records to understand the full scope of damage Jake had caused to their construction company over the years. What we discovered during that painful investigation revealed that Jake's systematic theft had been far more extensive and destructive than anyone in our family had realized. The business records told a story of gradual financial deterioration that our parents had attributed to economic downturns, increased competition, and the normal challenges of running a small construction company in a difficult market. But the pattern of unexplained losses and accounting irregularities pointed to systematic embezzlement that had been ongoing for over 5 years, not the 2 years federal investigators had initially discovered. Jake had been stealing from the family business since he was 22 years old, shortly after Dad had given him access to company accounts and bookkeeping responsibilities as part of what our parents believed was helping their son develop work ethic and business skills during his transition to adult independence. The early thefts had been small and carefully disguised as accounting errors or misplaced receipts, But they had steadily increased in frequency and amount as Jake became more confident about his ability to manipulate the books without detection. His gambling addiction had provided cover for his theft, as our parents attributed any suspicious financial activity to his personal problems rather than deliberate criminal behavior against their business. Over 5 years, Jake had embezzled nearly $300,000 from the family construction company money that represented years of Dad's labor and the financial foundation our parents had been building for their retirement and Mom's medical care during her cancer treatment. The sophisticated methods Jake used to conceal his theft revealed criminal skills that went far beyond simple gambling addiction or opportunistic family theft. He had created fake vendor invoices for work that was never performed, altered payment records to show money going to legitimate expenses that actually went into his personal accounts, and manipulated tax records to hide the missing funds from accountants and government oversight. Jake's theft had forced our parents to work longer hours and take on additional debt to cover business expenses that should have been paid from company profits he had stolen. They had delayed their retirement plans, sacrificed personal purchases, and struggled with stress-related health problems while Jake was using their money to fund his criminal operations and gambling activities. The impact on their business's reputation and growth potential was devastating, as they had been forced to turn down large construction projects because they couldn't afford the upfront materials and labor costs that Jake's theft had made impossible to cover from company accounts. Several long-term employees had been laid off during what Dad believed were temporary financial difficulties, but the records showed that their salaries were actually being diverted to cover Jake's systematic embezzlement, rather than legitimate business challenges requiring workforce reduction. The family business that our grandfather had started and our father had spent 20 years building into a respected local construction company was on the verge of bankruptcy because Jake had been systematically stealing the working capital necessary to maintain operations, pay employees, and invest in equipment and growth opportunities. Mom's breakdown as she reviewed the evidence of Jake's long-term theft was heartbreaking to witness, as she realized that many of the financial struggles and sacrifices she and Dad had endured over the years were directly caused by their son's criminal behavior rather than external economic factors beyond their control. The revelation that Jake had been destroying their family business while positioning himself as a helpful son who was trying to contribute to family financial stability through his work with company bookkeeping was a betrayal that cut deeper than his identity theft against me or even his recent theft of Mom's cancer treatment money. Jake had spent years watching our parents struggle with stress health problems and financial anxiety caused by his theft while maintaining the facade of being a concerned family member who was working hard to support their business success and financial security during challenging economic times. The records showed that Jake's criminal sophistication had been developing over years of practice with family theft before he expanded into identity theft, targeting elderly strangers through addiction support groups and community organizations where he could exploit trust relationships for criminal purposes. But the most devastating discovery was evidence that Jake had been planning to steal even more money from the family business to pay his criminal associates and cover his gambling debts with forged documents prepared to authorize major withdrawals that would have completely bankrupted the company and destroyed Dad's life work. The business insurance policies that Dad had purchased to protect against theft and fraud specifically excluded losses caused by family members or employees with authorized access to company accounts, meaning that Jake's systematic embezzlement couldn't be recovered through insurance claims designed to protect against external criminal activity. Our parents faced the possibility of losing not only their business, but also their house, which they had used as collateral for business loans that Jake's theft had made impossible to repay according to the original payment schedules established when the company's finances were stable and profitable. The financial destruction Jake had caused to our family's economic foundation would take years to repair, even with the recovery of some stolen funds through federal prosecution of his criminal operations. The systematic nature of his theft had created debt obligations and damaged business relationships that couldn't be easily resolved through legal proceedings or asset recovery efforts. As Mom and I worked through the devastating evidence of Jake's systematic destruction of their life's work, I realized that his criminal activities had been motivated not just by addiction or greed, but by a deliberate desire to control and destroy the family members who loved him through systematic financial devastation that would make them dependent on him for solutions to problems he had secretly created. Working closely with federal investigators and forensic accountants, I helped uncover the true scope of Jake's criminal wealth and the sophisticated financial networks he had established to hide money stolen from dozens of victims over the past 2 years. The discovery process revealed criminal operations far more extensive and profitable than anyone had imagined. Jake's offshore banking arrangements included accounts in 3 different countries with non-extradition treaties containing over $400,000 in money stolen from elderly victims, family members, and the various fraud schemes he had been operating through his criminal network across multiple states. The offshore accounts were established under multiple false identities that Jake had created using stolen personal information from his elderly victims, allowing him to move money internationally without creating paper trails that could be easily traced by law enforcement agencies investigating his domestic criminal activities. Federal investigators were able to trace the offshore funds through sophisticated financial analysis that revealed Jake had been living a completely secret luxury lifestyle, while his family struggled with medical bills, business financial problems, and the stress of dealing with what they believed were his gambling addiction and recovery challenges. The hidden wealth included not just offshore bank accounts, but also expensive vehicles registered under fake names, luxury apartment rentals in major cities that our family knew nothing about, and investment accounts containing stocks and bonds purchased with money stolen from vulnerable elderly victims who trusted him during their most vulnerable periods. Jake had been maintaining multiple residences across different states, using his criminal wealth to fund a lavish lifestyle that included expensive restaurants, luxury travel, and entertainment expenses that totaled more than most families earn in several years of legitimate employment. The forensic accounting revealed that Jake's supposed gambling addiction had been largely fabricated to cover his true criminal activities and provide emotional manipulation opportunities with family members whose sympathy and guilt could be exploited for continued financial support and protection from accountability. While our parents worked extra hours and delayed their retirement to cover business losses caused by his theft, and while our grandfather lived in fear from threatening phone calls about debts he never incurred, Jake had been using stolen money to fund luxury vacation trips to expensive resorts and entertainment venues across the country. The sophisticated money laundering operations Jake used to clean his stolen funds involved networks of criminal associates who specialize in different aspects of financial fraud, including people who helped him establish false identities, others who facilitated international money transfers, and contacts within financial institutions who enabled large transactions without proper verification procedures. Jake's criminal network was far more extensive and professional than federal investigators had initially realized, involving dozens of people across multiple states who worked together to identify vulnerable victims, steal their identities, and convert stolen personal information into accessible funds that could be distributed among criminal participants according to agreed-upon profit-sharing arrangements. The discovery of Jake's hidden wealth meant that restitution could be provided to many of his elderly victims who had lost their life savings and homes to his fraud schemes, offering some measure of justice for people whose trust and vulnerability had been exploited by someone they believed was helping them organize their finances for protection during their retirement years. But the offshore account investigation also revealed that Jake had been planning to flee the country if his criminal activities were ever discovered by law enforcement, or if his family members became too suspicious about his behavior and threatened to expose his crimes to authorities who could hold him accountable for his systematic theft and fraud. The escape plans included detailed arrangements for establishing a new identity in a country without extradition treaties with the United States, using criminal contacts who specialize in helping wanted fugitives disappear permanently while maintaining access to hidden wealth that couldn't be recovered by law enforcement or returned to victims. Jake's preparation for international escape demonstrated that his criminal activities had been carefully planned and executed by someone who understood the risks involved and had taken sophisticated precautions to avoid accountability for crimes that had destroyed dozens of innocent people's lives while funding his luxury lifestyle and criminal network operations. The evidence of Jake's secret wealth and escape plans provided federal prosecutors with additional charges related to money laundering, flight risk violations, and conspiracy to avoid prosecution that could add decades to his potential prison sentence if he were convicted of the extensive criminal activities documented by the FBI's investigation. Federal investigators were able to freeze Jake's offshore accounts and recover most of the stolen money for distribution to victims through court-ordered restitution programs, ensuring that his crimes would not provide him with long-term financial benefits, even if he managed to avoid conviction on some of the charges he was facing. The recovery of stolen funds also provided some financial relief for our family's business and medical expenses, though the emotional damage caused by years of manipulation and betrayal would take much longer to heal than the financial problems created by his systematic theft and fraud operations. As the full scope of Jake's criminal wealth and luxury lifestyle was revealed through forensic investigation, I realized that every financial struggle our family had endured over the past 5 years had been deliberately caused by someone who had the resources to help us, but chose instead to use our difficulties as emotional leverage for continued manipulation and criminal activity. 2 months after his arrest and the discovery of his extensive criminal operations, Jake made one final desperate attempt to manipulate our family's emotions and secure help escaping the consequences of his crimes. The phone call came while he was facing the possibility of 20 years in federal prison without parole, and his approach revealed the true depths of his sociopathic character and complete lack of genuine remorse. Jake's call came from the county jail where he was being held pending trial on federal charges, his voice initially carrying the same tearful desperation that had characterized his previous manipulative appeals for family assistance during crisis situations he had created through his criminal behavior. But this final conversation was different from his previous manipulation attempts, because Jake knew that our family now understood the true scope of his crimes and could no longer be deceived by claims about gambling addiction or promises about recovery and personal change that had never been genuine from the beginning. Jake's desperation had reached a level where he was willing to abandon all pretense and reveal his true personality in ways he had never risked before gambling that family loyalty and emotional manipulation could still override our logical understanding of his criminal character and the dangers he represented to innocent people. The conversation began with Jake's familiar pattern of emotional appeals about family bonds and forgiveness, but when those tactics failed to generate the sympathetic response he was seeking, his demeanor shifted dramatically to reveal the calculating criminal who had been hiding behind a carefully constructed facade of vulnerability and addiction. Jake's true demand was that I help him escape from the country using criminal contacts from his identity theft network, who specialized in helping wanted fugitives disappear permanently while maintaining access to hidden wealth that law enforcement hadn't yet discovered or frozen through asset seizure proceedings. His escape plan required access to emergency funds that our grandfather had entrusted to me years earlier for family crisis situations. Money that Jake knew about because he had been systematically investigating our family's financial resources and hiding places as part of his long-term criminal planning and preparation for eventual discovery of his crimes. Jake's request for help with international escape revealed that he had maintained active relationships with criminal associates despite his arrest, and that his criminal network remained operational and willing to help him avoid prosecution in exchange for continued access to his expertise in identity theft and elder fraud operations. When I refused to provide any assistance with his escape plans, Jake's emotional mask completely dropped to reveal a level of rage and vindictiveness that confirmed my suspicions about his sociopathic personality and his complete lack of genuine care for family members he had been exploiting and manipulating for years. Jake's threats against me and other family members who had cooperated with federal investigators were specific and detailed, demonstrating that he had been planning revenge against anyone who dared to hold him accountable for his crimes or interfere with his criminal operations by involving law enforcement agencies. His final words during our conversation included explicit threats to kill himself in ways that would maximize psychological damage to family members using suicide threats as one last manipulation tactic designed to make me feel guilty for refusing to help him escape justice for crimes that had destroyed dozens of innocent people's lives. But Jake's most revealing statement was his casual admission that he had never felt genuine love or concern for any family member, and that his entire relationship with our family had been based on calculated manipulation designed to exploit our emotions for his financial benefit and protection from accountability for increasingly serious criminal behavior. The sociopathic confession confirmed that the brother I had grown up with and loved had either never really existed or had been completely replaced by someone who viewed family relationships as strategic resources to be exploited, rather than genuine emotional connections deserving of respect, honesty, and reciprocal care. Jake's complete lack of remorse for the elderly victims whose lives he had destroyed through systematic identity theft was particularly chilling, as he casually dismissed their suffering as necessary casualties of criminal operations that had provided him with the resources and lifestyle he felt entitled to, regardless of the consequences for innocent people. His final manipulation attempt involved claiming that his criminal activities had been motivated by a desire to accumulate enough money to help our family with their financial problems, a lie so transparent and offensive that it demonstrated his continued belief that our emotions could be manipulated even when we fully understood his criminal character. The conversation ended with Jake screaming threats and accusations when he realized that his manipulation tactics were completely ineffective and that our family had finally developed immunity to the psychological warfare he had been waging against us for years, while systematically destroying our financial security and emotional well-being. As I hung up the phone and immediately reported his threats to federal investigators, I felt a sense of closure about my relationship with someone who had spent years exploiting my love and loyalty while secretly viewing me as nothing more than a resource to be used for his criminal enterprises and personal benefit without regard for the damage he caused. 6 months later, I stood outside the federal courthouse, watching Jake being led away in shackles after receiving an 18-year sentence without possibility of parole for his extensive crimes against elderly victims and family members. The judge's words about the calculated cruelty of his crimes and the need to protect vulnerable people from predators who exploit trust relationships echoed in my mind as justice was finally served. The federal prosecution had been thorough and devastating, with testimony from dozens of elderly victims whose lives had been destroyed by Jake's systematic identity theft operations. The courage of those elderly witnesses, many using walkers and wheelchairs to attend court sessions, demonstrated the human cost of his crimes in ways that made his manipulative claims about gambling addiction seem even more offensive and transparent. Jake's criminal network had been dismantled through coordinated raids across multiple states, with his associates receiving sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years for their roles in elder fraud money laundering and violent intimidation operations that had terrorized innocent families for years, while generating millions of dollars in illegal profits. The restitution payments ordered by the court had provided some financial relief to Jake's victims, including our own family, though the emotional healing process would take much longer than resolving the monetary damages caused by his systematic theft and manipulation over the years. Our grandfather Paul was finally able to sleep peacefully in his own home without fear of threatening phone calls or strange men watching his house. His legal obligations to Jake's forged loans having been resolved through federal intervention and victim compensation programs designed to protect elderly people from identity theft consequences. Mom's cancer treatment had resumed at the specialized center, with full funding restored through recovered stolen assets and victim compensation. Her prognosis improved significantly by the advanced treatments that were now accessible thanks to the resolution of financial obstacles created by Jake's theft of her treatment fund. Dad's heart condition had stabilized as the stress of dealing with unexplained business losses and family financial crisis was replaced by the relief of understanding that their struggles had been caused by criminal behavior, rather than their own failures as business owners and parents who had somehow created the problems they couldn't solve. The family construction business was slowly recovering with proper financial controls and security measures in place to prevent future theft. Dad's reputation in the construction community restored as word spread about the criminal activity that had caused his company's previous financial difficulties and workforce reductions. But the most meaningful healing came through my reconciliation with David, who had proposed again after we spent months working through the years of misunderstanding and manipulation that Jake had used to destroy our relationship during our most vulnerable period together. Our wedding was small and private, attended only by family members and friends who had supported us through the discovery of Jake's crimes and the legal proceedings that followed. Grandpa Paul walked me down the aisle, his presence representing the family bonds that had survived Jake's attempts to destroy them through systematic manipulation and betrayal. David and I had purchased a house using money from my portion of the recovered stolen funds, creating the home and future together that Jake had sabotaged years earlier through his calculated interference in our relationship and his criminal theft of my financial security and creditworthiness. Our parents had entered family therapy to address the enabling behaviors and denial patterns that had allowed Jake's criminal activities to escalate unchecked for years, while innocent people suffered the consequences of their misguided loyalty to someone who had been systematically exploiting their love and trust. The therapy process had been difficult, but necessary, helping Mom and Dad understand how their protective instincts had been weaponized against them by someone who used their emotions as tools for avoiding accountability, while continuing to harm innocent people through sophisticated criminal operations. The restraining orders and no-contact directives meant that Jake would have no opportunity to continue his manipulation attempts against our family members during his incarceration, providing legal protection that reinforced our emotional boundaries and commitment to healthy relationships based on honesty and mutual respect. Standing in our new home, surrounded by family members who had learned to prioritize truth over comfortable lies, I reflected on the painful lesson that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to enable someone's destructive behavior, even when that person is family and their consequences seem harsh. Jake's crimes had taught our family that loyalty without accountability is not love, but rather a form of cruelty that enables continued harm to innocent people while preventing genuine healing and growth for everyone involved in the destructive patterns. The elderly victims who had testified at Jake's trial had shown remarkable courage in holding him accountable despite their vulnerability and the trauma they had experienced through his exploitation of their trust during some of the most difficult periods of their lives. Their example had inspired our family to choose justice over misguided protection, recognizing that enabling Jake's criminal behavior had not helped him, but had instead allowed him to hurt more innocent people while avoiding the consequences that might have encouraged genuine change rather than escalating criminality. As I looked at the photo on our mantle, showing 4 generations of our family together, before Jake's crimes had torn us apart, I understood that real family bonds are strengthened rather than weakened by truth-telling and accountability, even when those processes are painful and require courage to maintain. The recovered stolen money had provided restitution to all of Jake's victims and financial stability for our family's medical expenses and business recovery. But the true healing had come through learning to value justice over denial and authentic relationships over manipulation and emotional blackmail. 6 months of peace and safety had shown our family what healthy relationships looked like when they were based on honesty rather than fear, and when family loyalty meant protecting each other from harm rather than enabling destructive behavior that hurt innocent people while destroying the enablers themselves. What challenges have you faced in your family when someone you love was hurting others, and you had to choose between loyalty and doing what was right? Sometimes the hardest decisions lead to the most meaningful healing, and I would love to hear about your experiences with difficult family situations in the comments below. Thank you for listening to my story and staying with me through this difficult journey. I hope that sharing what our family went through can help others recognize the difference between enabling destructive behavior and showing genuine love through accountability and truth. Please like this video if it resonated with you, subscribe for more stories about overcoming family challenges and finding strength in difficult situations, and share this with anyone who might need to hear that choosing justice over misguided loyalty is sometimes the most loving thing we can do for people we care about. I wish you courage in your own difficult family decisions and the wisdom to know that protecting innocent people from harm is always more important than protecting harmful people from consequences they have earned through their choices and actions.